Hey everyone, welcome to our webinar. It's 1 o'clock. Thank you for being here. We're going to get started in just a couple of minutes, but while we're waiting for folks to join, if you're here, go ahead and drop a message in the chat and let us know where you're joining from. Philly, all right. All right, we'll give folks a few more minutes to join. What'd you eat for lunch, Ben?
I had leftover pizza.
Nice.
Can't go wrong.
Jersey, California, Maryland, Philly. Hey everyone, thanks for being here.
Philly, Massachusetts.
Philly, Massachusetts. Hey Craig.
Oh, Craig.
Thanks for being here, everybody. South Philly, very specific. All right. Give it just a couple more minutes. Thank you for being here to learn about SEO for website migrations. We'll get into it very soon. Miami. All right, we can go ahead and get started with the intros while we're letting the stragglers join here. So I'm Leah McDaniel. I'm joined by my esteemed colleague, Ben Pearl here. We are SEO specialists at Forefront, which is a digital marketing agency based in the Philly area. I'm joining today from Massachusetts. Ben, where are you today?
Delaware.
Delaware. All right. So today we're going to be talking about, excellent timing, website migrations and SEO and how to ensure a smooth transition, whether you're designing a new website, transitioning to a new website. We can help make sure, or help you make sure, rather, that your traffic doesn't just drop off a cliff. And we'll be going into some tips and tricks for how to do that, as well as the particular things that you need to check along the way. So before I get started, I want to tell you all a story. The reason why this is important, can I get the next slide? Excellent. All right, so the reason why this is important, we've seen this more times than we would like with clients, where they work for months and months and months building this beautiful new website. Their whole team is working super hard on content and design and templates and all of these beautiful things. They're so excited for launch day. The new site goes live, and then they check their performance and they see something like this, where their traffic and clicks and impressions just totally drop off a cliff. And so if you skip the kind of behind the scenes SEO design and transition work, that can happen, and it sadly happens a lot. So we're going to give you some tips and tricks to make sure that this isn't what it looks like for you when you launch your new site. So who we are SEO specialists at Forefront. We're a digital marketing agency based near Philadelphia. And what we're going to be teaching you today is how to successfully migrate your website to make sure that your SEO not only survives the transition, but hopefully thrives and does even better after the fact. So some things that we're not going to be talking about today. We're not going to be talking about your CMS, whether you should be on Wix or WordPress or Squarespace or something else. We're not going to be talking about that today. We're also not going to be talking about design and aesthetic considerations, really. Things like your site templates and your brand colors and your logos and your fonts and things. That is absolutely part of transitioning to a new website, but that's not really related to the SEO part that we're going to be talking about. What we are going to be talking about is the steps that you need to take to properly prepare for launching your new site as it relates to your SEO. So we're talking spreadsheets. And there's a little bit of a process that you go through. Like any good SEO process, it starts with research. And then you move into SEO design, which I'll talk about a little bit here or on the next slide. And then you go into actually building the site and then transitioning to the site. So that research involves audience research, competitor research, auditing your own internal content and performance on your site. Then you move into the SEO design, which has to do with more of the site structure, how your site is going to be set up to be optimized for search, both at a kind of structural, foundational level, and then on the individual pages themselves. So unfortunately, can I go back to that last slide? Thank you. A lot of folks start at the site build process, where you're focusing more on the design stuff and actually building the site, but you don't have this foundational research done. And that is when you end up with results like I showed you on that other slide. So a lot of work goes in before you actually start building anything. And I can go to the next slide now. Thank you. So what is SEO design? SEO design refers to the strategic approach of enhancing your website's structure, content, and overall user experience, or UX, to improve its visibility and ranking on search engine results pages, or SERPs. So it starts with information architecture. That involves organizing your site's content in a logical way that helps both users and search engines understand and navigate the site effectively. And then you do some audience research. You want to understand who your visitors are, understand the demographics and the search intent so that you can better tailor the content on your new website to meet their needs. It also involves an aspect of competitor research. That's analyzing what the other folks in your industry are doing so you can identify gaps, things where they're maybe falling short, and opportunities to enhance your own strategy based on what your competitors are doing. Then there's a little bit of technical SEO mixed in. That has to do with optimizing things kind of on the back end of your website. So that's things like your site speed, mobile friendliness, secure connections, things like that. And then there's this user experience piece. That's about creating an enjoyable journey through your site for your visitors. So that's things like, is your navigation intuitive? Is your design responsive? Things like that. And so we kind of put this all together in this SEO design process into a few different reports and wireframes. So you get kind of a visual of what SEO features you need to have on the individual pages, as well as some reports and spreadsheets that break out how your site is actually going to be organized. So when we're talking about SEO design, it's all of those things kind of coming together there. To go more into detail, I'm going to pass it over to Ben.
Cool. Thank you, Leah, for the intro there. So yeah, like Leah mentioned, there are sort of 4 distinct processes and steps that we take when migrating a website. And at the very first, sort of stepping stone of that process is the research phase. So I'm going to take you through that entire process, right? So we're going to start from the research phase all the way to, getting the site up and running and then making sure for the long term that it's set up to succeed. So the first part of that, like I mentioned, is going to be the planning process here. And just like any project, no matter whether it's a website migration or otherwise, you need a solid plan before you jump into anything, right? And when we're talking website migrations, there's sort of 2 key areas that we like to focus on in particular. The first one is auditing your current rankings and traffic. So basically getting a benchmark of how your current site is performing, right? Because you want to know, after you pour all these resources and money into redesigning your website, what kind of effect does that have afterwards for the long term? So you want to get a good sense of, which pages on your site are the most popular amongst your audience, which one of those have the higher rankings, which one could use a little bit more help during the redesign process. And again, just sort of set a benchmark to measure up against how your redesigned site performs against your current site. And then the next big piece is on the URL side of things, right? So the individual URLs that exist across your site. You want to develop a thorough migration plan, not only for the URLs that are on your current site, but also for the ones that will exist on your new site, right? And you might not have that second piece to start off with when you're in this planning stage, but you want to account for that at some point throughout the process. And in tandem with that, one of the things that we also like to ensure is that when we're designing those URLs, if we're going to change them, right, it depends on whether you're, changing your root domain, so whatever comes after the www of your current site, whether we're changing that or if we're staying the same and just changing everything in the subfolder level. Either way, we want to make sure that we're designing URLs that are made for not only humans, but for search engines too, right? Especially for e-commerce sites, right? There's a lot of automation that goes on in the back end in terms of populating parameters and things like that that don't always look clean. But in the same way that a human would interpret a URL that has something along the lines of white dress shirts, a search engine like Google is also going to have an easier time recognizing what a page means based off its URL, rather than having a really long string of parameter nonsense that doesn't really correlate with anything. So again, two main pieces that we want to plan for: benchmarking your current performance and making sure that your URLs have some sort of future state plan. Then after the planning stage, we're going to jump into developing optimized content, which again, this is going to be something that you want to do regardless if you're migrating your website or not, right? If you're keeping your current website, you want to make sure that you have optimized content anyways. But what we're talking about today, we want to make sure that your new website has SEO-friendly content, because that's what it's ultimately going to need to succeed. The biggest piece of this is going to be to identify the gaps in your existing content. And by gaps, we essentially mean taking a look at your competitors, seeing what kind of content they have in their current setup, seeing what's performing well, what makes sense for your business too, right? Because something that your competitor might be writing about or has content about might not be applicable to your business per se. So you want to make those considerations throughout that process too, seeing what does perform well, but what also makes sense from a time and resources standpoint for you to focus on for your business. And while we're designing that content, we also want to make sure that we're thinking about our end user, right? So every business has their, at least a target audience, right? Sometimes they have a secondary and tertiary one as well. But no matter what, when you're writing content, there should be some sort of end user in mind, right? The person that you're ultimately writing this content for. A good exercise for this step would be to develop user personas, which we won't talk about a whole lot in this presentation. But user personas, getting out there in the real world and actually talking to your customers, right? Again, if you're an e-commerce platform, people who buy your products and services, that can be a great way to figure out who those people actually are and how you can tailor your content to speak directly towards them. And as we're thinking about the end user and the types of content we want to create, right? Anyone who works in SEO knows that keywords are very, very paramount in developing content overall. So we want to make sure that we're choosing the right keywords, right? In this NerdWallet example, they're writing about the best credit cards of the current month. So obviously best credit card is going to be a pretty significant keyword for them to target, but we also want to make sure that we're using them strategically throughout our content, right? Long gone are the days of keyword stuffing and nesting keywords all throughout your content just to make sure that the page is relevant enough. Make sure that you're not overwhelming your user, right? Write how you would just normally, right? People want content that's written by humans for humans, so don't try and overdo it. But then lastly, and this is probably one of the more important pieces to focus in on here, especially in modern SEO, is incorporating multimedia where possible, right? And I say where possible because sometimes, again, because of budget and time constraints, You might not have the resources to necessarily, develop images, infographics, everything under the sun that you would ideally like to. But one of the great things about developing multimedia, especially in Google's current algorithm, is that, again, we won't go into this super in depth, but they essentially want you to keep users on your site for as long as possible and have them avoid bouncing back to the SERP once they click into your results. One of the great ways that we can do that is by developing multimedia. That's going to be your surefire way to make sure that users are engaged past just the written content on your site and on your pages. As they're engaging with the content, they're going to either engage with the multimedia itself, right? Whether it's a video, an infographic, whatever it is. And then B, it might also lead them to other parts of the site, which keeps them within your content ecosystem. And again, the main purpose of that is preventing them from bouncing back to the SERP and visiting a competitor site. So once we're done developing what looks, pretty on the front end of your site, right, of the content that's visible to your user, we have to make sure that the sort of under the hood aspects look good as well. So we can't ignore technical SEO. That's going to be our second step here. So again, your website just can't look pretty. It needs to run efficiently too. And there's a couple of things that we want to focus on here. The first thing, very paramount, is to build for mobile first. Google was sort of the first one to put this into motion of crawling and indexing pages, how they look on mobile devices. There was a couple of years there where they weren't doing it for all websites, but now they are. So essentially what that means is that Google, at least other search engines do this as well, but they crawl your website how it looks on a mobile device. So keep that in mind, right? You can look at your analytics and see how many users are originating from a desktop versus a mobile device. But even if you have a larger audience that visits your website through desktop, that's not how Google will view your site. It's going to view it through a mobile device. So you have to make sure that everything looks good on that device. Second bit here, and this one is typically overlooked, especially during website migrations, is schema markup. And for those of you who aren't familiar with schema markup it's essentially code that lives in the sort of under the hood part of your site that tells Google and other search engines more about your content, right? A good example of this is if you're a hospital, for example, you can indicate what your address is. You can indicate what services you provide. You can indicate, a whole bunch of other things that can be assumed by the audience who visits your website and sees all of your content. But what schema markup does, it's going to allow for these things called rich snippets to appear in search results. A good example of that is like star ratings for e-commerce sites. Unless you have the schema markup implemented, it's going to be very hard and very almost impossible for the star ratings to exist for organic results. So if you don't have schema markup on your current site, a website migration project is a great opportunity to start developing that. And even if you do have existing schema markup, you can sort of tweak what you have already and optimize your current schema setup. So that way you can test it on, if you're going to use a staging site for your website migration, you can test it on the staging site before you even push it live, just to make sure that nothing goes wrong. But again, very overlooked aspect of website migrations. Make sure to pay attention to your schema markup. Then loading times. Loading times have been a very big push, especially in the sort of the ranking factor variety of things within SEO. Again, this one is pretty straightforward without getting into the nitty gritty. Google typically likes your pages to load within or under 2.5 seconds. Again, there's some nuances that exist beyond that, but just know the longer your site and your pages take the load, the more likely your visitors are to leave your site, even before your content loads in some cases. So make sure that all of your content loads effectively and efficiently. And then the last bit, which also is sometimes overlooked, is optimizing your sitemap. So for people who don't know what a sitemap is, it's basically a collection of all of the valid pages that live on your website. And luckily, I know Leah mentioned earlier that we're not going to talk CMSs, but if there's one CMS thing I will mention, is that optimizing your sitemap can be easy in some cases because some CMSs do this for you. in this example, we're looking at the forefront sites. We generate our sitemap using this plugin called Yoast SEO. That will automatically create a sitemap for us based off of all the valid pages that live on our site. So instead of having to make that a manual process, we do that automatically. But again, there are certain cases where that doesn't always result in the cleanest of processes. So you want to make sure that there's no, the big things to look for are no redirecting URLs, so nothing with a 301 or a 302 status code, and nothing with a 400 status code. So your 404 is basically any invalid page that lives on your site, because we want to make sure that we're pointing search engines only to the pages that are valid, or basically ones that users can visit. Great. Yeah, so we've talked about so far on-page content, right? How your site looks on the front end. Just covered technical SEO, so what it looks like under the hood. The next two pieces are going to be what we want to take care of after building those two essential pieces. So the first one here is going to be performance analytics, right? Because like I mentioned earlier, you want to get a baseline of how your current website is performing so you can see how the migration process affects things over the long term, because that's going to give us hard data. And hard data is the only true thing that can tell us whether the migration was a success or not. And just like the last couple of slides here, there's going to be a couple key pieces to focus on. So the first one is to install new tracking codes. So if you're migrating your current site and you're not changing the root domain, so again, the URL piece that comes after the www, you likely don't have to do this. But if you are changing the URL and have to play around with your tracking tools that you currently have set up, it'll be wise to implement new tracking codes. The snippet here is from Allbirds, the vegan shoe company, based on what their Google Tag Manager tracking code looks like in the HTML of their website. And then based off of those tracking codes, the other thing that we want to look into, if you haven't already with your current site, is ensuring all of your Google tools are connected. Now, I understand there might be some businesses or people out there that have other analytics tools that they use to track their website's performance. That is totally cool. But since Google's tools are free for the most part and are widely popular, those are going to be the ones that or make the most sense to rely on. So the ones that we're looking here from left to right are Google Search Console, Google Tag Manager, which is the piece of tracking code that we just looked at, and then Google Analytics 4, which is sort of the main analytical platform that exists nowadays. So again, we want to make sure that those tools are set up, but another nice to have as part of this whole redesign process is making sure that you're setting up regularly scheduled crawls, which at Forefront we like to use this platform called Screaming Frog, which is basically an independent bot crawler that can scrape data from websites, all sorts of things. It's nice to set those up on a regularly recurring basis, just so you can see. It's especially useful, and we'll talk about this in the next slide too, to catch errors over time, especially in the technical side of your website too. So if there's a piece of code that goes awry or things like that, those site crawls can really come in handy to catch those things before they become a real big issue. And then lastly, another thing that can typically be overlooked in some website migrations is using heat maps to map out your user engagement on your website. This can be especially helpful for your e-commerce, basically any website that has a clear conversion process, from start to finish. This step using heat maps will explicitly tell you what parts of your web pages your users are engaging with, and then that'll be able to tell you as the site owner or the developer, or whatever your role might be, what parts they're using, whether they're the intended parts, and whether there's something within the conversion funnel that's a little bit off that you can fix, right? Because we need to know if there's an issue to fix in the first place. So that's what heat maps are going to be really helpful to use. And the last bit here that I will go over, so we've talked about, pretty much all of the implementation stuff so far, but the key thing, and again, I feel like this is something that is very overlooked, especially in website migrations, is to not treat them as set it and forget it projects, right? Most people will design their new website, launch it, and they'll forget about it, right? They'll continue on as if the project never happened in the first place. But that is definitely the inappropriate mindset to take, because like any SEO knows, our work is never done. Things change all the time. So we have to stay on top of how the migration went, not only for the first couple months. This could span a year, 2 years, depending on how big of a redesign you're actually going through. So like I mentioned at the very beginning, right, closing the loop here, we want to monitor our rankings and our traffic just to see how over time, and it's not unusual, make this very clear, it's not unusual for website performance to decrease right after a site migration. There's a couple of different reasons for that, but it's basically the search engines just relearning your site, especially if you're changing your root domain, relearning your brand name, your expertise, the authority that you bring to your industry. That's very normal. So if you do see that within your site migration, don't freak out. But that's why we want to monitor our rankings and our traffic over time, just to make sure that those levels that we're seeing right after the migration eventually get to the points where we want them to be based on the resources and money that we spent. Like I mentioned, in terms of heat maps, we want to make sure that our conversion processes are still functioning properly. Again, this is very key for you e-commerce sites out there. You want to make sure that your users are engaging with your product pages in the correct manner, or the intended manner of how you want them to. They're making purchases. They're engaging with your brand how you want them to. And again, heat maps are going to be a great way to ensure that the conversion process is still flowing how you want it to. And again, going back to site crawls, very useful practice to get in the habit of running. Again, this is a screenshot directly from Screaming Frog, the platform that we use here at Forefront. This is basically giving us a sample of all the different, either metadata or technical issues or opportunities that exist on this particular site. It can tell us the change from the previous crawl to the current crawl. Do lots of cool things. There are other tools out there like this that exist. But again, for obvious reasons, this can help you catch those issues before they actually become issues, or become either, if they're already an issue, a huge fire. So we can extinguish those before they get out of control. And the last bit I'll leave you with here, and again, this is something that we want to do no matter if you have an existing website and you're not migrating it at all, but especially if you're migrating your current website. We want to make sure that we're optimizing content based off of performance, right? And there's a balance here, because we want to make sure that the performance part of this is relevant to our business needs, right? Because our website, for example, might target 1,000 keywords, but of those 1,000 keywords, only maybe like 10 or 15% of them actually lead to meaningful conversions for our brand overall. So we want to make sure that we're focusing in on the pages that are excelling, right? Because that means that within this current state of the algorithm, the content that we produce is performing against those user needs. But B, we want to make sure that we're also paying attention to the pages that might not be doing so hot. And if that is the case, we want to make sure that we're also looking at which of those pages actually mean or like have more tangible value to our business, right? Because as much as we would like to have every page firing at all ends and having great rankings and traffic, that isn't always feasible. So that'll be a great way to prioritize your efforts, especially as a business owner, an SEO, developer, whatever your role might be. So that way, you can make time for other things outside of the post website migration work that you just went through. So I just took you there from the planning stage all the way through to post. And you might have some questions about what we just went over, and how you might actually go about implementing some of this stuff. So I'm going to pass it back over to Leah here, who's going to talk to you about if you need the help to do this, how you can choose the right partner to ensure that you're following the right steps from start to finish.
Thanks, Ben. Yeah, so I would bet that at this point in the presentation, our audience has kind of separated into two camps. We've got the people who have been taking their notes and they're following along and they're like, yes, I got this. I totally understand how to do this. I'm going to go start right now. And then there's probably the other half of people who are like, oh my gosh, there's so much more to this than I thought there was. I cannot do this all myself. I need help. And if you're in the second camp, you're not alone. That's probably most people. So if you decide that you need some help with your website migration, and especially with the SEO kind of stuff before you get started with the site design, you're going to want to look for a good SEO partner to help guide you through this process. And if you've never done this before, how do you know what makes a good SEO partner? How do you know what kind of organization you want to work with? So you should look for a partner that has a proven track record with doing this, someone who has done website migrations before, who has a process and can show you, like, this is how we've done it. You want somebody who has expertise in both the technical SEO side and the content strategy. You want someone who's going to communicate with you clearly and give you updates instead of just leaving you in the dark about what's going on behind the scenes. And you want someone who's going to use data to back up and make these decisions instead of just working off of hunches or I think this will work best. You want to work with a partner who's going to do the research and look at the data and make decisions based on real quantifiable things. And like Ben mentioned, with SEO, things change all of the time. There are always algorithm updates. There might be something where at the beginning of your SEO transition process is, best practice. This is the thing to do. And that could completely change by the time your site goes live 6 months to a year later. So you want to work with a partner who's going to stay on top of those things and can pivot and say, oh, we actually need to tweak this based on the way things are going in the larger SEO universe now. So we've worked with a lot of clients on their SEO transitions at Forefront. We've worked with clients on the front end, and then we've worked with some clients after they transition and they decide they need a little help. But LBBC is a client that we worked with at the beginning of their site transition. They're a great client, and in honor of Breast Cancer Awareness Month, I thought that they might make a great case study for this presentation. So we helped them transition to a new website not that long ago, maybe a couple years ago. And as part of that process, we did for them some extensive market and audience research. We looked at all of their content, hundreds and hundreds of pages of just really dense medical content that is super valuable for their audience. We looked at their information architecture. That's what I was saying about how the site is actually organized kind of on the back end. We dug into their technical SEO. We worked on analytics and tagging. We developed wireframes for them to help with the user experience. And we collaborated with their teams of designers and developers throughout the process to make sure that these SEO strategies were implemented from the beginning. And once their new site went live, after all of this work on the back end, they saw a 225% increase in clicks to target keywords. So when you transition to a new site, it doesn't have to fall off a cliff. It doesn't even have to fall off and then maybe recover. You can transition your website and have good performance pretty much from day one with the new website. It just takes some work on the back end. So if you would like to work with us, or if you would like to learn more and think about it a little bit, we have a free transition guide for you. We put together, you can get it on our site. It's forefront.us/transition-guide. You can download it. There you go. We've got a QR code for you. You can go ahead and download that. If you have questions while you're going through that guide, definitely reach out to us. On this next slide, there's contact information for Ben and for myself. So if you're going through this guide, go get it, download it. And if you have questions, just reach out to us. We'd be happy to answer your questions. And if you decide that you need some more help as you're going through the SEO transition process, Forefront can probably help you with that. So I've been Leah McDaniel. This is Ben Pearl. Thank you so much for joining. We are going to jump into questions here in a second. Before we do that, Ben, did you have anything that you wanted to say?
No, yeah, hopefully this has been insightful to you all that have joined us today. Even if you're an experienced SEO or website developer, hopefully you learned one thing. Yeah, without further ado, we'd love to jump in some of the questions here. I know we have some on the this side panel here.
So yeah, okay.
Looks like
so I'm seeing from Christina. Go ahead, Ben.
Cool. Yeah, I'll take mine first. Yeah, so Christina, so there's two questions that she asked. For me, she asked if there's a way to decide which pages you need to redirect from your current site to your migrated one, and which ones might not or aren't really required to be redirected, and if there's a rule of thumb surrounding that. So yes, there's a rule of thumb. It's basically, so again, like I mentioned a couple of times during my piece there, if you're changing the root domain of your website, let's say you're going from www. I'm going to make up something here, target.com, and you're going to www.walmart.com, right? It's obviously going to change the root domain of your website, and it's going to change the path for all of the URLs that exist underneath your root domain. So that one's going to take a little bit more work. So you'll essentially have to redirect all of the pages across your website at that point. But on the flip side, let's say you're going to keep your root domain as www.target.com. You only have to redirect the URLs that change from your existing site to your migrated one. So let's say you have, a subfolder that's going to stay the same, but you have a product URL that's going to be tweaked just a little bit. So you do have to have a 301 redirect from whatever it is now to what that new URL is going to be. But let's say you have a URL on your current site that's going to stay the same as what's on your migrated site. Then you don't have to have a redirect, right? Because the path is still going to be the same. So that's the general rule of thumb. There's obviously some nuances that exist underneath of that. But just know if you're going to change the root domain, there's going to be more work involved. If you keep it the same and not all of your URLs are going to change, then you can, sort of bypass some of that work that you could do otherwise.
Oops, I'm muted. Thank you, Ben. So looking at Christina's other question, she was asking about the timeline for carrying out this SEO transition if you're working on migrating to a new website. And so in true SEO fashion, I have to say it depends. It depends on how large your site is, how much we're actually going to be migrating. But in general, I would say reach out if you're going to work with an SEO partner. Reach out to them around the time that you decide to migrate your site so that they can have as much lead time as possible to do this kind of behind the scenes stuff. I would say in general, kind of off the cuff, we usually work on site migrations for a few months for clients. I want to say 3 to 4 months. Does that sound right to you, Ben?
Yeah, give or take. It depends on the project, but that's a rough estimate.
Yeah. So you want to loop in your SEO partner as soon as possible in the process, just to make sure that things aren't getting held up there. But I would say give it a few months before you're planning on building and launching the site. All right, we have a question from Craig. What are some of the specific techniques you use to make sure high-performing pages stay strong through the transition? Do you want to take that one, Ben?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so sort of beforehand, before the transition even goes through, like I mentioned, it's always good to optimize your existing content and even think of the gaps that you're missing from your competitors. Especially so thinking about the pages that already exist on your site and are high performing, right? In a lot of those cases, the content's already strong to begin with. That's why it's performing so well. But as Leia mentioned, there's always the risk of sort of losing that visibility post migration. So it might be a good opportunity, especially if the resources to do so, to optimize those high performing pages, even if it's just a couple of tweaks just to bump the content freshness up for those pages, right? So if an updated one in particular in 2 years or so, small things like changing the meta description, or if it's a blog post, even changing the updated date, but making sure that you're updating the page enough to warrant a date change. Those are all really great things that you can think of. There's a couple different ways to, again, achieve that freshness quality. Post-migration, right, that's a little bit of a different story. There's a couple different ways that you can handle it. I think one of the ways that can be especially helpful is internal linking, right? So that's something that you want to definitely make sure that you're at least thinking of pre-migration, but even post, right? Making sure that you have enough link equity pointing to those high priority pages, especially from a hierarchical standpoint, right? So let's say you have a page that lives pretty far down in your site hierarchy, maybe 3 or 4 subfolders down. It's a little hard to find for the search engine, obviously, if you have a especially large site. So one thing you can do is start pointing links from maybe the 2nd or 3rd level, or even your homepage even, to that deep lying page. So that way it's A, easily findable by the search engine, and B, is assigned more equity by the links that it's being passed to. And the equity of those links being passed depends on the authority of those individual pages. So keep that in mind too. But that'll sort of help, again, from the on-page perspective and sort of the SEO netherverse of equity and authority and things like that. That'll ensure, at least mitigate a lot of the risks that you do face for your high-performing pages going from pre to post-migration.
Cool, thank you. Yeah. We have a question from Kate. How often should we revisit our website strategy post-migration to ensure continued effectiveness? So I really like 3 months as a good kind of round number for checking back in on things. Checking on things quarterly, you're not getting too caught up in the daily or weekly ebb and flow of things. You can really see more of a trend. So I like 3 months just in general for SEO things, whether it's checking in on the performance of new content. It's enough data that you can see trend lines. You're not getting hung up in the minutia, but it's a short enough time that you're not letting something, if something's going wrong, it's not going wrong for very long. So I would say check in every 3 months. Maybe right after you launch the site, check in a little bit more frequently. Again, so if something is going wrong, you catch it sooner. But so I would say check it more frequently, maybe every couple of weeks to every month right after you launch the new site. And then from there, check in on maybe a quarterly basis. Does that ring true for you too, Ben?
Yeah. I think big picture, you want to look at things quarterly, right? Just make sure everything's running smoothly from a sort of a 10,000 foot view. And then definitely monthly, right? I know for a lot of our clients, we meet with them on a monthly basis, just to check on performance and things like that. That's a good cadence, because that sort of gives you enough time to work on anything that you might have caught the previous month going into the next month. But also if there's any true issues that arise, they might take a couple of weeks to formulate anyways. So that'll give you, again, enough time to see those trends start to take place, but also tackle them before they get out of control.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We have a question from Bob. If there's a page on the old website that gets a lot of traffic and backlinks, but it's off-brand and not really relevant anymore, do you recommend removing this page when launching a new website? That's a very interesting question, Bob. So again, I would say it depends. Not having any additional context about this site or what that page is, I would say there might be an opportunity to migrate that page, and then on the new version of it, direct people farther into the site to something that is relevant. So if there is a nice segue where you can still keep all this traffic, but then you can get the people who land on that less than relevant page to then go do something more relevant on the new site. That could be a good opportunity. Again, it's going to depend on just how irrelevant that page is, but I think it would be worth exploring migrating it anyway. What do you think, Ben?
Yeah, I'm in the same camp. My answer would be to use your noggin and figure out how to make it work. Because if it is truly that authoritative and driving that much traffic and has, you know, a lot of backlinks pointing from different sources, then it obviously means something to your audience, or at least it did at one point in time. So, I mean, the worst you can do is redirect the page right to something that is at least topically relevant that exists on your site going forward. But it obviously doesn't ring true, or at least as effective as keeping the page around and keeping the authority that it has. So I would say be a modern marketer and make it work. Yeah.
All right. Kate has another question. How do you decide between a full site migration and just revamping your current site? Is there a rhyme or reason for choosing either one, or is it more of a personal preference? I think a lot of times people end up having to migrate because of limitations of their CMS. And again, I know I said we weren't going to talk about CMSs, but a lot of times a site is built on an old enough version of a CMS that you get to a point where you just really can't continue to update and tweak it. Like you get to a point where you're running into technical limitations and you just have to upgrade the site and kind of start over from scratch. A lot of times it is a personal preference. A lot of brands will launch a whole new site if they go through a rebrand or they merger or they add a new service, things like that. So there are kind of relevant and useful like milestones in the life of your business where launching a new site might make sense. So some of it's going to be personal preference. Some of it is going to be technical necessity. And some of it is it's just going to kind of make sense as part of your business's strategy. What do you think, Ben? Are there any other things that I'm forgetting about here?
No, yeah, I think functionality is the biggest thing. I have a client right now who their current CMS just doesn't do what they need it to do. So they're transitioning their website to something more robust. So that is very much, I think the primary reason to choose a migration over just revamping your current site. I think resources too, you know, depending on how big your company is in terms of revenue and profits, you might not have the resources to do a full migration of your site, right? Because that can be a little bit more expensive. So you might go down the revamp path. You might be happy with where your site functionality lives right now, and can at least get by with it for the next couple of years. So yeah, I think in that case, revamping instead of a full migration might be the move. Again, there's a couple different reasons. I don't think there's just one in particular that would make you decide over one or the other, but there's definitely some key considerations that can kind of sway you one way or the other.
All right, we have a question from Brad. Can redirects eventually be removed after a certain amount of time? Do search engines learn what the permanent redirect is and therefore no longer needed on the site? This is another it depends. Do you want to take this one, Ben? I feel like I've been taking all the questions.
No, yeah. So can they be removed after a certain time? Again, it depends, right? So I think right after the migration, if you want to have those in, and then there's the complication of redirect loops over time, where you're essentially you have a redirect path that already exists, and you migrate or you're redirecting that page to another page, and it gets kind of messy at that point. So yeah, I think over time you can probably, and again, this depends on the specific redirect itself. But yeah, there are certain cases where you can get rid of the redirects. I would say to avoid doing that for at least a couple of years, right? Because even though you're establishing the topical connection between the old page, the one that's already redirected, to the new one, right? From a technical standpoint, it just makes sense to have that connection established for the long term. especially if there's like old links out there, like backlinks pointing from third-party sources to that old page. Those users can still find the new page. So yeah, that's a good reason to keep them around, at least for a couple of years. But again, it depends what the long-term vision of those redirects look like, and whether or not they can actually be removed or not.
Yeah, another thing I would say, Brad, is I don't think that setting up 301 permanent redirects, there's really no downside to it. Like it's not hurting you in any way, as long as they're set up correctly. And like Ben said, you're not throwing users into a redirect loop. If they're set up correctly, there's not really a downside to it. And another consideration would be, like Ben said, the backlinks to the old link. You would want to use a tool like SEMrush or something to check on that, because if there are historical backlinks pointing to the now incorrect URL, you don't want to lose that backlink juice. So you would want to keep those redirects in place as long as those old backlinks exist. And you might be able to reach out to the sites that are linking to you and ask them to update the link. But in the absence of that, I would just keep the redirects up. Let's see. Ravi says, what criteria other than traffic do you use to determine whether to consolidate or retire old content during a migration? So there's definitely traffic and visibility, your clicks and impressions in Search Console. But if you have a piece of content that doesn't get a lot of traffic, doesn't get a lot of visibility, you might still want to keep it if it's really relevant to a service that you provide or really answers a question that your audience might have. If it's not getting traffic and visibility, that's a pretty good sign that you're going to want to work on that content. And as part of this migration, maybe put some work into improving that content, making sure that it is better serving your audience. But there are definitely going to be cases where even content that's not performing super well is still really relevant and should have its place on your new site. Do you have anything you'd want to add to that, Ben?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a more robust content audit process you can do. I know here at Forefront, we look at traffic, right? I think that's the biggest piece. You can also look at conversions, right? So whether there's enough, either purchases, any event or KPI that occurs on your site that is originating from those pages, right? Whether it's users landing on those pages and making the conversion, or whether it's part of their user journey and it's leading to a conversion later on down the line. There's a whole bunch of things. You can do backlinks too, right? So what third-party sources are gravitating towards on your site. You can do duplicative word counts, right? So whether a page is sort of similar to another page, you can consider consolidating the two, even if they're both kind of relevant. There's lots of different metrics out there that we can use to sort of make those designations. But yeah, I would think traffic is the big one, conversions, and yeah, basically anything that is relevant to your business and its needs that sort of designates what metrics you need your content to fulfill as well.
So that leads super well into Ravi's follow-up question, which is, what are the key SEO metrics to monitor closely in the first few weeks after launching a new site?
Yeah, you want me to take that, Leah?
Yeah, take it away.
Yeah, so again, I feel like a broken record here. So tracking is your big one, because that's going to dictate how visible your new website is after the migration. Obviously, you can look at it holistically from all channels, right? So you can do organic, paid, direct, all those things. But since we're SEOs, we're especially concerned about organic traffic. So going back to the post monitoring stuff that I talked about, Google Search Console is a great way to measure your clicks and impressions over time. And that's especially true right after a site migration. I think impressions is probably the more important. I don't want to use the word important, but it's more valuable metric, at least in the short term, right after migration, because that's essentially telling you how many times your site is being seen within organic search results after the migration, you might not be seeing the clicks that you want to see, but it's at least telling you my website is being viewed 1,000,000 times or 500,000 times, something like that. That at least gives you a baseline of how visible it is and how much click activity we can get out of that visibility, right? And basically the idea is to increase the efficiency or the ratio of those two over time, to where based on the high visibility that you're getting, you're also getting clicks out of it too.
But again, so Ben, would you say that checking in Search Console for clicks and impressions are really the big things that people should be looking at after the migration?
Yeah, if I had to pick two or like one place to look after migration, I would say stick with Search Console. If you want to branch out just a little bit, you can go into GA4 and look at your events and conversions. But again, you need visibility to get those people to visit your website in the first place. So yeah, my vote is stick with Search Console.
Cool. So I feel like all of these questions just really speak to the fact that there's a lot to consider during this process, and that there are a lot of kind of data points to check on and things to keep in mind as you're working toward transitioning to your new site. And if it's more than you can kind of keep straight in your mind, you're certainly not alone on that. And so if you decide to work with an SEO partner, Forefront would love to work with you. But can we get the little resource QR code back up again? We do have that free download that goes into some detail about this process and about the things to check on. So definitely download that guide. And like I said, feel free to reach out to Ben or myself, or you can submit a contact form through the Forefront site. We'd be happy to answer any questions that you have. And like I said, we'd love to work with you if you decide to transition to a new site in the future and are looking for an SEO partner. So thank you so much, everyone, for your time and for being here today. We loved teaching you about this. We hope it was helpful, and hopefully you can get back to your afternoon invigorated and full of new ideas about SEO. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.